Well, they are two separate pieces of legislation. One is called the Network and Information Security Directive, or the NIS Directive. The other is called the General Data Protection Regulation, commonly called GDPR. Both happen to be on parallel tracks. They've been negotiated and developed over the last 3 or 4 years. And right now, as of December 2015, both are in the final stages of completion. Let's start with the data protection regulation, the GDPR. So the purpose of that is to protect data on EU citizens and to give EU citizens greater rights in how their data are used. It is an update, and it's meant to replace what's called the Data Protection Directive, which has been the law of the land in Europe for about 20 years on data protection. So this is revising and replacing the current law. The rewrite in the update was driven by 2 factors overall. The first is the major changes in technology over the last few decades that have allowed for greater use, processing, collection of data, particularly in the online world. The second thing that's driven this rewrite is a desire to harmonize the data protection rules across the European Union and to facilitate the better sale of services by EU companies across the EU. One complaint about the former directive was that it was being implemented differently by all of the EU member states, so it was quite burdensome. Switching to the NIS directive, its focus is on raising the cybersecurity resilience of EU companies and member states. It was driven itself by 2 things as well. One was a desire to raise in response to cybersecurity incidents that were happening that people were becoming more aware of, and the other was to raise the cyber readiness of EU countries. Some were quite sophisticated, and others had barely begun in terms of cybersecurity policies. The scope of each law is slightly different. In terms of the General Data Protection Regulation, it applies to both data controllers and data processors. Data controllers are considered those entities or units that make decisions about the processing of data on an individual. So that can include collection, use, other activities. A data processor would be a third party that undertakes those activities on behalf of the data controller. The GDPR applies to companies that are based in the European Union, but it also applies to companies that are based outside the EU if they're processing data on EU citizens. The NIS directive, its scope is different. It has 2 categories of companies that it applies to. The first is called operators of essential services, and that could be considered basically critical infrastructure. It's those entities whose activities are considered to be very essential or critical to the economy. So in the NIS directive, there's a list of the types of industry sectors that are included. So there's energy, transportation, financial services, banking, those types of things. Although the NIS directive itself lists those categories, it will be up to the member states to determine exactly which companies within their borders fall into those categories. So that's a separate step of the NIS directive. The second set of companies that are included under the NIS directive are called digital services providers. And those are cloud services providers, search engines, and online marketplaces. And those are meant to be covered with what's called a lighter regulatory touch than the operators of essential services. The timing is slightly different as well. So the GDPR is a regulation, which in Europe means that it must be implemented essentially as it's written in all 28 member states. And it's specifically because the prior piece of legislation, the Data Protection Directive, was being implemented differently in so many different countries and causing bureaucratic headaches for companies that they chose the route this time of a regulation that's implemented consistently. So once the GDPR is published in the official journal of the European Union, it enters into force, and then it will apply 2 years after that. So essentially it gives companies and member states a 2-year transition to come into compliance. The NIS directive is a directive. It's just that. It sets a minimum baseline for member states, but each of them will be writing their own implementing legislation to put it into effect. Once this directive is published in the official journal of the European Union, the member states have 21 months to write that legislation. And then after that, the member states have another 6 months to identify their operators of essential services. But so even though each one still has a bit of time to actually come into effect, a number of companies are already getting prepared, and in fact have been getting prepared over the last couple of years because there are some major changes coming down the road.